He lived alone for 40 years. Then a mail-order bride arrived with tears in her eyes. Up in the frozen Colorado mountains, a silent old man has buried his past and his heart beneath the snow. No one dares climb his trail, until one winter morning, a wagon appears, and a trembling woman steps down, holding a letter with his name on it. He swears he never sent for her. Yet the letter is real, and so are the tears on her face. Inside his lonely cabin, two strangers sit across a fire, haunted by secrets that neither dares to speak. When she opens his old Bible, everything changes. The name inside belongs to her dead sister, the woman he once loved. Who forged the letters that brought her here? And when 40 years of silence meet a storm of truth, will this lonely man finally find redemption, or lose everything he has left? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The snow swirled around Sebastian McCready as he squinted through the gathering dusk at the wagon lurching up his trail. His weathered hand gripped the handle of his wood sled tighter, knuckles white beneath leather gloves worn smooth by decades of use. No one ventured this far up Silver Hollow's winding paths without good reason, especially not in weather that made even the mountain goats seek shelter. The wagon wheels creaked against the fresh powder, the horse's breath coming out in great white plumes. Sebastian watched, rooted to the spot, as the driver guided the team around a treacherous bend. His mind flashed back to Mr. Turner's words at the trading post earlier that day. "Woman been asking after you, McCready. Said she had business with you." He'd brushed it off then, like he brushed off most town gossip. But now here was this wagon, fighting its way up his mountain. The driver, a young man Sebastian recognized as one of the livery stable hands from Silver Hollow, pulled the team to a halt a few yards away. "Mr. McCready," he called out, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "Got someone here to see you, sir." Sebastian didn't move, didn't speak. He watched as a figure stirred beneath the wagon's canvas cover. A woman emerged, wrapped in a thick wool cloak, her face obscured by a dark veil. She gripped the wagon's side with gloved hands as she carefully made her way down, her boots sinking into the fresh snow. "Much obliged for the ride, Thomas," she said to the driver, her voice clear and steady despite the cold. She reached into a pocket and pressed something into the young man's hand. Payment for the journey, Sebastian supposed. The woman turned toward Sebastian then, and even through the veil, he could feel her studying him. She took a few steps forward, her movements careful on the snowy ground. "Mr. McCready," she said, reaching into her cloak. "I believe this belongs to you." She extended her hand, holding out an envelope that had been creased and smoothed multiple times. Sebastian stared at it, unmoving. The paper trembled slightly in her outstretched hand, from cold or nerves. He couldn't tell. "Ma'am," he finally said, his voice rough from disuse, "I don't recall expecting any correspondence." A small laugh escaped her, though it held more anxiety than humor. "No, I suppose you wouldn't." She reached up with her free hand and lifted her veil, revealing a face that spoke of both gentility and determination. Her eyes were kind but direct, set in a face that had seen its share of hardship. "I'm Margaret Ellsworth, though most folks just call me Maggie." Sebastian's throat tightened at the name. 3 months ago, in a moment of desperate loneliness he'd rather forget, he'd written to a marriage broker in Kansas City. He'd burned the copy of his letter the next morning, ashamed of his weakness, and had convinced himself that would be the end of it. The woman, Maggie, was still holding out the letter. "You wrote to Mrs. Hawthorne's marriage bureau," she said softly. "I have your letter here." Sebastian's hands clenched at his sides. That letter was a mistake, ma'am. Perhaps, she agreed, but didn't lower her hand. But it brought me here all the same. The wind picked up, sending loose snow skating across the ground between them. Thomas shifted uncomfortably on his perch. Miss Ellsworth, ma'am, I should be heading back before this weather worsens. Maggie nodded, though Sebastian noticed a flicker of uncertainty cross her face. Of course, Thomas. Thank you again. The young man touched the brim of his hat, then clicked to his team. The wagon creaked as it turned, leaving deep ruts in the snow as it began its careful descent back toward town. Sebastian watched it go, acutely aware of the woman standing before him, still holding out that damning letter. The same crushing loneliness that had driven him to write it now warred with 4 decades of carefully maintained solitude. Ma'am, he said finally, I reckon you've had a long, cold journey for nothing. I'm not the man you're looking for. Maggie lowered her hand at last, tucking the letter back into her cloak. With respect, Mr. Macready, I believe I'll be the judge of that. She glanced around at the deepening snow, then back at him. Now, unless you mean to leave a woman to freeze on your doorstep, perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere warmer? Sebastian felt the weight of her gaze, steady and unflinching despite the cold reddening her cheeks. He thought of his cabin, sparse, utilitarian, unchanged since Anna's death 40 years ago. No place for a lady, but the alternative. Storm's coming, he said gruffly, turning toward the path that led to his home. Best come along? He heard the crunch of her footsteps in the snow behind him as she followed, struggling slightly with what appeared to be a carpet bag she'd retrieved from the wagon. Without looking back, he reached for it. Give that here. After a moment's hesitation, she relinquished the bag. They walked in silence, the wind carrying stray snowflakes between them. Sebastian's mind raced with unwelcome thoughts. This woman, this stranger, had traveled hundreds of miles based on words he'd written in a moment of weakness, words he'd regretted by sunrise. His cabin came into view, smoke still rising from the chimney where he'd banked the fire before heading to town. He set her bag down to unlock the door, then stepped aside to let her enter first. Maggie paused in the doorway, removing her snow-dusted cloak. Sebastian watched as she took in the simple room, the pot-bellied stove, the rough-hewn table, the single chair, the narrow bed in the corner. Her eyes lingered on the shelf where his Bible sat alongside Anna's photograph, but she made no comment. It's not much, he said, feeling an unfamiliar need to explain himself. Never saw the need for more. It's warm, she replied simply, moving closer to the stove. She rubbed her hands together, holding them out to the heat. And dry. That's not nothing, Mr. Macready. Sebastian set her bag down and moved to add another log to the fire. The familiar actions gave him something to focus on besides the strange reality of another person in his space. A woman who thought she was here to be his wife. Mrs. Ellsworth, he began, straightening up. Miss, she corrected gently, or Maggie, if you prefer. Miss Ellsworth, he amended. I don't know what that letter promised, but I'm not in the market for a wife. I'm an old man who's set in his ways. You seem like a fine woman. You deserve better than a life up here with... He gestured to himself, to the sparse cabin. With this... Maggie turned from the stove to face him fully. I'm a widow, Mr. Macready, 48 years old. I've buried a husband and a son. Her voice was steady, but Sebastian could hear the grief beneath her words. I'm not looking for romance. I'm looking for purpose. Your letter spoke of needing help with your home, with tending to the sick in these mountains. I was a teacher before I married, and I've worked as a midwife since losing my James. I have skills that could be of use here. Sebastian remembered writing those words, late at night with his loneliness pressing in like a physical weight. He'd mentioned the local families, scattered across the highlands, who had no access to proper medical care. Had written of his own clumsy attempts to help when children fell ill or injuries needed tending. "The winters here are harsh," he said, though his resolve was weakening. "The work is hard. Town's a half-day's ride in good weather." "I'm stronger than I look," she replied, a hint of a smile touching her lips. "And I'm not afraid of hard work or solitude." She paused, then added more softly, "I'm not here to replace anyone, Mr. Macready. I know about your Anna." Sebastian's chest tightened at the name. "How?" "Mrs. Hawthorne included it in her letter to me. Said you'd lost your intended to fever during the silver rush." Maggie's eyes were gentle but direct. "Grief's a heavy burden to carry alone. I know that better than most." The cabin fell silent except for the crack and pop of the fire. Outside, the wind whistled through the pines, carrying the promise of a long night of snow. Sebastian looked at the woman standing in his cabin, this stranger who somehow didn't feel quite like a stranger, and felt something shift in his carefully ordered world. "I can't offer you much," he said finally. "I'm not asking for much," she replied. "Just a chance to be useful, to help where help is needed." She smiled then, a real smile that reached her eyes. "And perhaps, in time, we might find we're good company for each other." Sebastian looked down at his rough hands, then at the woman who had traveled so far based on nothing but a letter written in a moment of weakness. The snow fell harder outside, blanketing the world in white, while inside his cabin, something that felt remarkably like hope began to stir. Sebastian closed the cabin door against the biting wind, watching as Maggie huddled closer to the pot-bellied stove. Her hands trembled, not just from cold, as she reached into her cloak and withdrew a crumpled envelope. "I have your letter here," she said softly, unfolding the paper with careful fingers. Tears welled in her eyes as she smoothed the creases. "It's addressed to Mr. Sebastian Macready of Silver Hollow." Sebastian frowned, moving closer. The paper was quality stock, the kind used by proper businesses back east. The handwriting flowing across it was neat and precise, nothing like his own rough scrawl. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "I never wrote no letter." Maggie's hands tightened on the paper. "But the advertisement, in the Kansas City Star, it was quite specific. A Christian gentleman seeking a wife, someone with medical knowledge who wouldn't mind the isolation." She swallowed hard. It mentioned Silver Hollow by name. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's windows. Sebastian moved to add another log to the fire, buying time to think. He hadn't been to Kansas City in 30 years, hadn't written to any newspaper. Someone had used his name, his location. But why? "There's been a mistake," he said finally, straightening up. "I'm sorry you came all this way, but I didn't place any advertisement." A gust of wind howled around the cabin's corners, and Maggie jumped slightly. Through the window, the falling snow had turned into a white wall, obscuring everything beyond the porch. Sebastian ran a weathered hand over his face. "Storm's setting in proper now. Wouldn't be right to send you back out in this." He gestured to a narrow cot in the corner, separated from his bed by a worn blanket hanging from the ceiling. "You can take the spare bed tonight. We'll ride to town when the weather clears and sort this out." "Thank you," Maggie whispered, relief evident in her voice. She kept her cloak wrapped tight around her shoulders as she settled into one of the wooden chairs at his small table. Sebastian moved to the stove, where a pot of stew had been simmering since morning. He spooned portions into 2 bowls, then cut thick slices from a loaf of bread. It had been decades since he'd shared a meal with anyone in this cabin. When he set the bowl before her, Maggie closed her eyes and folded her hands. "Dear Lord," she prayed softly, "thank you for this food and for shelter from the storm. Thank you for Mr. Macready's kindness to a stranger. Amen." Sebastian shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had prayed in his presence. The words stirred something in him he'd rather leave buried. They ate in silence, broken only by the storm's fury and the clink of spoons against bowls. Sebastian found himself studying his unexpected guest. Maggie's face bore the gentle dignity of someone who had known both joy and sorrow. There were lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter, but also deep grief etched into the corners of her mouth. "Tell me about yourself," he said gruffly, surprising himself as much as her. Maggie set down her spoon carefully. "There's not much to tell. I was a school teacher before I married. My husband James was a good man, a carpenter. We had one son." Her voice caught slightly. "We lost James to pneumonia 6 years ago. And then, last year, our boy—" She stopped, pressing her lips together. Sebastian knew that look. He'd seen it in his own mirror after Anna died. The expression of someone trying to hold themselves together when grief threatened to tear them apart. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Maggie nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When she continued, her voice was barely above a whisper. "After Thomas, my son, passed, I couldn't bear to stay in our house anymore. Everything reminded me of what I'd lost. I'd been helping the local doctor as a midwife, but—" She twisted her hands in her lap. "When I saw the advertisement, it seemed like Providence, a chance to be useful somewhere new, somewhere I might be needed." The wind rattled the windows again, and Sebastian rose to bank the fire for the night. His mind worked over what she'd told him. Someone had deliberately used his name, drawn this woman here under false pretenses. The question was why. "Mr. Macready," Maggie said softly as he finished with the stove, "I know this isn't what either of us expected, but until the storm passes—" She left the sentence hanging. Sebastian looked at her, really looked at her, a woman alone who'd traveled hundreds of miles on the strength of a lie with nowhere else to go. His 40 years of solitude urged him to guard his walls, but something else, something he thought long dead, pushed back. "You'll stay until the weather clears," he said firmly. "We'll figure out the rest then." Relief softened Maggie's features. "Thank you," she said simply. Sebastian showed her where he kept the wash basin and extra blankets, then retired behind his own blanket partition. He lay awake for a long time, listening to the storm and the unfamiliar sound of another person's breathing in his cabin. Just before sleep claimed him, he heard Maggie whisper what sounded like a prayer. The words themselves were too quiet to make out, but their cadence stirred memories of Anna, of his own long-abandoned faith. He turned toward the wall, trying to shut out both the sound and the unwelcome feelings it awakened. Tomorrow, he told himself firmly, they would ride to town and sort out this mistake. Tomorrow, his solitude would return. Tomorrow, everything would go back to normal. But as he drifted off, a small voice in the back of his mind wondered if normal was what he really wanted anymore. Morning crept into the cabin with fingers of pale light. The storm had passed, but fresh snow lay thick across the landscape, transforming Sebastian's homestead into a world of white silence. He rose early, as was his habit, to find Maggie already awake, stoking the dying embers in the stove. "Good morning, Mr. Macready," she said softly, straightening up. "I hope you don't mind. I thought we might need the warmth." Sebastian grunted, caught off guard by the simple domesticity of the scene. The cabin felt different somehow, warmer despite the biting cold outside. He pulled on his heavy coat and boots. "Got chores to tend to," he said, reaching for the door. I'll help, Maggie offered, already wrapping herself in her cloak. When Sebastian started to protest, she added firmly, I'm no stranger to farm work, Mr. McCready, and 4 hands make lighter work than 2. Outside, their breath clouded in the crisp morning air. Sebastian led the way to the small barn, where his goat, Martha, waited impatiently for her morning milking. To his surprise, Maggie moved with quiet confidence, speaking softly to the animal as she approached. There now, sweet girl, she murmured, running gentle hands over Martha's coat. The goat, usually skittish with strangers, leaned into her touch. Shall we get you sorted? Sebastian watched as Maggie positioned the milk pail and began working with practiced movements. Her hands were sure and steady, and Martha stood quietly under her touch. The familiar sound of milk hitting the pail's bottom filled the barn. Learned from my grandmother, Maggie explained, catching his look. She kept goats all her life. Back in the cabin, Maggie insisted on helping with the indoor chores as well. She found a broom in the corner and began sweeping while Sebastian brought in more firewood. The familiar tasks took on a strange new rhythm with 2 people working in tandem. I'll make us some breakfast, Maggie said, eyeing the supplies in his modest pantry. She located the cornmeal and soon had a pot of mush bubbling on the stove. The homey smell filled the cabin, reminding Sebastian of mornings long past. As they ate, Sebastian couldn't help but notice how Maggie's presence had already begun to transform his sparse home. The floor was cleaner than it had been in years, the dishes were neatly stacked, and somehow the light seemed to fall differently through the windows. After breakfast, Maggie began tidying around the hearth. Sebastian watched from his chair, feeling oddly unsettled by the way she moved through his space, touching things that hadn't been touched in decades. She paused, her attention caught by his Bible lying open on the small table near his chair. You read scripture? She asked, her voice gentle with surprise. Sebastian shifted uncomfortably. Used to, every day. Now just sometimes. Maggie stepped closer to the Bible, then suddenly went very still. Her hand trembled as it reached out to touch the inside cover. Sebastian knew what she was seeing, the faded name written there in careful script. Anna Ellsworth. Anna, Maggie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She turned to face Sebastian, her eyes wide with recognition. Anna Ellsworth. She was my sister. The spoon Sebastian had been holding clattered to the table. The sound echoed in the sudden silence of the cabin. He stared at Maggie, really seeing her for the first time. The shape of her eyes, the gentle curve of her chin. Features that echoed another face, one he'd tried so hard to forget. Your sister? His voice was barely audible. Maggie nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. She left Kansas in 1843, following the gold rush. We received word she'd died of fever in the mining camps. Her hand rested on the Bible's worn cover. This was hers? Sebastian's throat tightened. Memories he'd kept locked away for 40 years came flooding back. Anna's laugh, her quiet strength, the way she'd read from this very Bible every evening. She was to be my bride, he said roughly. We were to be married that spring. Maggie sank slowly into the chair opposite him, her face pale with wonder. I was only 12 when she left. Mother didn't want her to go, but Anna was determined. She said she'd write once she was settled. She brushed away a tear. The letter never came. Only word of her passing months later. Sebastian stood abruptly, moving to the window. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and steady. Inside, the past he'd tried so hard to bury was suddenly alive again, breathing in the form of this woman who carried echoes of his lost love. She spoke of you, he said finally, still facing the window. Told me about her little sister who loved to learn, who wanted to be a teacher. He turned back to face Maggie. She was proud of you. Tears flowed freely down Maggie's cheeks now. I've carried her memory all these years, never knowing what really happened, never knowing she'd found love here. The silence that fell between them was different now, holy almost, as if Anna's spirit filled the space between them, binding their separate griefs into something new. The day passed in a strange dance of shared memories and careful movements. They spoke little, but the silence was comfortable, filled with understanding. Sebastian found himself watching Maggie as she moved about the cabin, seeing both the shadow of Anna and something entirely her own. A quiet strength, a gentle wisdom that seemed to soften the sharp edges of his solitude. As evening approached, Maggie knelt by the fire, adding another log to the flames. The firelight played across her face as she turned to look at Sebastian. "Mr. Macready," she said softly, "I know this isn't what either of us expected, but—" She took a deep breath. "Might I stay? Just until spring? I have nowhere else to go, and perhaps—" She hesitated. Perhaps this is where Providence meant me to be. Sebastian stood at the window, watching darkness gather outside. 40 years of solitude urged him to refuse, to guard his walls. But something else stirred in his heart. Something that felt like hope, or maybe grace. He thought of Anna, of her faith in God's plan even when it seemed impossible to understand. He thought of the strange circumstances that had brought her sister to his door, of the comfort he'd found in simply sharing space with another soul who understood his loss. Slowly, deliberately, he nodded. Maggie's shoulders relaxed, and she smiled, a gentle expression that reminded him of candlelight in darkness. "Thank you," she whispered. The fire crackled between them, casting warm shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in silence. But inside, something had changed. The cabin no longer felt like a tomb of memories, but rather a place where new life might take root, where old griefs might finally begin to heal. Days melted into one another as the snow kept falling. The old cabin creaked under winter's weight, but inside, a gentle warmth began to grow. Sebastian and Maggie fell into an easy rhythm, like dancers who'd known the steps all along, but just needed time to remember. Each morning, Sebastian rose before dawn, pulling on his heavy coat and boots. The sound would wake Maggie, who insisted on rising to prepare breakfast despite his protests that she needn't trouble herself. "Nonsense," she'd say, already stoking the fire. "A body works better with a warm meal inside." The wagon driver, Tom Fuller, had left 3 days after bringing Maggie, promising to return once the pass cleared. "Might be a spell," he'd warned, eyeing the heavy clouds. "These mountain storms can last weeks." Sebastian spent his mornings chopping wood, the steady thunk of his axe echoing through the snow-laden pines. Sometimes Maggie would watch from the doorway, a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, admiring the efficient grace of his movements despite his age. Though he rarely spoke, his actions spoke volumes. The way he always brought in extra wood before she could ask, how he'd hung a line inside for drying clothes, the careful way. He'd repair any draft she mentioned. In turn, Maggie kept the cabin alive with small comforts. Her cooking filled the space with forgotten scents. Fresh bread, stewed dried apples, beans seasoned with the last of her precious pepper. Before each meal, she'd bow her head in prayer, and though Sebastian remained silent, she noticed his head would dip slightly too. One afternoon, while Sebastian mended a broken chair, Maggie discovered he had a talent for working leather. She watched, fascinated, as his weathered hands worked the awl through tough harness straps, his stitches neat and even. Would you teach me?" she asked, settling beside him at the table. Sebastian looked up, surprised. "Ain't proper work for a lady?" Maggie smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling. "I reckon proper's what keeps us alive up here. Besides," she added softly, "Anna always said idle hands make poor company for the Lord." Something flickered in Sebastian's eyes at the mention of Anna's name. Slowly, he nodded, shifting to make room beside him. "Here then," he said, passing her a length of leather. "Hold it just so." Under his patient guidance, Maggie learned to punch holes and pull waxed thread, her stitches growing straighter with practice. They worked in comfortable silence, broken only by his quiet instructions and the whisper of thread through leather. One morning, while Sebastian was out checking his trapline, Maggie decided to tackle the dust-covered trunk in the corner. She'd noticed Sebastian never went near it, and something told her it held pieces of the past he couldn't bear to face. Inside, beneath carefully folded quilts that smelled of cedar, she found a small silver locket. Her breath caught. She recognized it instantly. Anna had worn it every Sunday to church back home. When Sebastian returned, stamping snow from his boots, he found Maggie sitting by the fire, the locket cupped in her hands. She looked up, tears gleaming in the firelight. "She loved this so," Maggie said softly. "Mother gave it to her on her 16th birthday. Inside—" Her voice caught as she opened it, revealing 2 tiny portraits. "That's Mother, and there's Father." Sebastian stood frozen in the doorway, snow melting from his coat. Slowly, he crossed to her, his steps heavy with memory. "She never took it off," he said roughly. "Even when the fever—" He stopped, his hands clenching at his sides. Maggie rose and gently took his calloused hand, pressing the locket into it. "She was the gentlest soul I ever knew," she said. "Even when I was being a terror, she never raised her voice. Just had this way of looking at you that made you want to be better." Sebastian's fingers closed around the locket. A tear traced through his silver beard. "Used to read to the mining camp children," he whispered. "Had them all spellbound with her stories. Even the roughest men would quiet down to listen." They sat by the fire that night, sharing memories like precious gems. Maggie told him about Anna teaching her to make dolls from corn husks, about summer evenings when she'd brush Maggie's hair and sing hymns. Sebastian spoke of how Anna had tended injured miners, how she'd insisted on planting flowers outside their tent in the mining camp. "She believed beauty belonged everywhere," he said, staring into the flames, "even in the hardest places." The blizzard finally broke after 2 weeks, leaving the world transformed into a glittering white cathedral. Sebastian hitched his mule to the sled, preparing to take Maggie to town as promised. "Best we get you somewhere proper," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Preacher Jenkins' wife takes in travelers. She'll help you sort things." But Maggie stood in the doorway, her face set with quiet determination. "I'm not going," she said simply. Sebastian turned, frowning. "Can't stay here. Ain't right, ain't proper." "Mr. McCready," Maggie said, stepping forward, "I've prayed on this every night since I arrived. I believe the Lord brought me here for a purpose, not just because of Anna, though perhaps that's part of it." She gestured to the cabin, the valley beyond. "This place needs healing. Maybe we both do." Sebastian stood silent, snow falling from the harness in his hands. In the distance, a wolf's lonely cry echoed through the valley, reminding them both how isolated they were, how precarious life could be in these mountains. The cabin's log roof creaked under its burden of snow, the sound like old bones settling. "Ain't an easy life," he said finally, his voice rough. "Winter's long, spring's mud and work, summer's short and full of storms." Maggie smiled, the expression warming her eyes. I'm not afraid of work, Mr. McCready, and I reckon the Lord doesn't send us down easy paths when hard ones will teach us better." For a long moment, Sebastian stood motionless, his face unreadable. Then, slowly, he began unhitching the mule. "Best get inside then," he said gruffly. "Storm's left us plenty of work to do." Maggie's smile deepened as she turned back to the cabin. Through the window she could see their morning fire burning bright, smoke rising straight and true into the crystal winter sky. Perhaps Anna had guided her here after all, leading her sister to where healing could finally begin. For both of them. Inside, they settled back into their rhythm, Sebastian bringing in wood, Maggie putting on coffee. The old cabin seemed to sigh around them, as if finally accepting that its long loneliness was ending, that new life was taking root within its walls. The morning dawned crisp and bright, the storm's fury giving way to diamond-clear skies. Sebastian stood on his porch, coffee cup steaming in the mountain air, surveying the damage. The goat pen had collapsed under the weight of snow, its weathered boards scattered like picked-over bones. Maggie joined him, her boots crunching on the fresh powder. "Quite a mess," she observed, pulling her shawl tighter. Sebastian nodded. "Need to rebuild before the next storm." He glanced at her sideways. "Ain't women's work, though." "Neither is living alone in these mountains," Maggie replied with a gentle smile. "Yet here we both are." They worked through the morning, Sebastian showing Maggie how to sort the salvageable lumber from the broken pieces. The physical labor warmed them despite the chill, and soon they both had shed their heavy coats. "Anna would have loved this view," Sebastian said unexpectedly, straightening up from examining a board. His eyes swept across the snow-covered valley below, where the rising sun painted the drifts in shades of pink and gold. Maggie paused in her work, sensing a rare moment of openness. "Did you two spend much time up here?" "Some." Sebastian's weathered hands traced the grain of the wood he held. "Used to bring her riding when I was courting her. She'd pack us a lunch. Always insisted on bringing a proper tablecloth, even way up here." A faint smile touched his lips. "Said just because we were in the wilderness didn't mean we had to eat like wild things." Maggie chuckled softly, the sound carrying on the crystal air. "That sounds like Anna. Remember how she used to set the table for Sunday dinner? Every fork had to be just so." As they worked, Maggie began to hum softly, old hymns she and Anna had sung in their childhood church. "Amazing Grace" floated across the snow, followed by "Sweet Hour of Prayer." Sebastian didn't join in, but his movements fell into rhythm with her singing. The sun climbed higher as they cleared away the broken pieces and began setting new posts. Sebastian showed Maggie how to brace the uprights while he tamped down the earth around them. Their breath fogged in the cold air, but the work kept them warm. "Anna loved this one," Maggie said, starting into Rock of Ages. Her clear voice carried across the valley while Sebastian measured boards for the pen's walls. She noticed his hands slow their work as she sang, as if the melody had caught him in memories. "She had a voice like bells," he said quietly when Maggie finished. "Used to sing while she worked. Didn't matter if she was cooking or mending or just walking to the store, always had a song." They worked steadily through the morning, the pen taking shape under their combined efforts. Sebastian's experience guided them, while Maggie's determination made the work lighter. When the sun reached its peak, they paused to share the lunch Maggie had packed: bread, cheese, and hot coffee from the thermos. "Much obliged for your help today," Sebastian said gruffly, accepting the cup she offered. "Wouldn't have gotten half so much done alone." Maggie smiled warmly. "Thank you for letting me help, and for your kindness these past weeks." She hesitated, then added softly, "I know this isn't what either of us expected." but I'm grateful for how you've welcomed me." Sebastian shifted uncomfortably, unused to such direct gratitude. "Ain't nothing," he mumbled, but his voice had lost its usual edge. They finished the pen as afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow. Standing back to survey their work, both felt the satisfaction of a job well done. The new structure stood sturdy against the mountain wind, ready to shelter Sebastian's goats through the winter ahead. That evening, as they sat down to a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Maggie bowed her head as usual. But instead of praying silently, she said gently, "Would you lead us in grace tonight, Mr. Macready?" Sebastian's hand froze halfway to his spoon. For a moment, he sat perfectly still, and Maggie feared she'd pushed too far. Then, slowly, he bowed his head. "Lord," he began, his voice rough as bark, "we thank you for—" He paused, swallowing hard. "For this food, and for—" His voice caught, decades of unspoken prayers tangling in his throat. Maggie reached across the table and laid her hand over his weathered one. "And for bringing us together in this season," she finished softly. "Amen." "Amen," Sebastian whispered, the word coming out half-choked. They ate in comfortable silence, the cabin warm against the falling night. Later, while Sebastian checked on the animals one last time, Maggie pulled a quilt from her trunk, one she'd brought from Kansas, pieced together during long winter evenings after her son's death. She folded it carefully and placed it on Sebastian's bed. When he returned, she had already retired to her room. Sebastian stood looking at the quilt for a long moment, his calloused fingers running over the careful stitches. The pattern was called Jacob's Ladder, he remembered. Anna had made one like it, lost long ago to time and grief. That night, as the first light of dawn began painting the eastern sky, Sebastian lay awake under Maggie's quilt. The cabin was quiet, except for the soft crackle of the banking fire and Maggie's steady breathing from the other room. "Lord," he whispered, his voice barely disturbing the pre-dawn stillness. "Thank you." The words felt strange on his tongue after so many years of silence. "Thank you for sending company to a stubborn old fool who didn't know he was lonely." Outside, the snow-covered hills began to glow with morning light, and somewhere in the distance, an early bird began to sing. The week brought warmer days that gnawed at the snowdrifts, turning pristine white into patches of brown and revealing the sleeping earth beneath. Water trickled everywhere, from eaves, between rocks, and down the mountainside in growing streams. The sound of dripping became a constant companion to Sebastian and Maggie's daily routine. One crisp morning, Sebastian noticed the creek swelling with snowmelt. "Better check the watercourse," he said over breakfast. "Make sure nothing's damming it up. Could flood if we don't clear it." Maggie nodded, already reaching for her boots. "I'll come along. 4 eyes are better than 2. They set out following the creek's winding path, Sebastian carrying a long pole for prodding debris, Maggie with a coiled rope slung over her shoulder. The morning air held the last bite of winter, but hints of spring whispered in the occasional bird song and the earthy smell of thawing ground. "Watch your step," Sebastian cautioned as they picked their way along the bank. "Ground's treacherous when it's half-froze like this." His voice carried the authority of decades spent reading these mountains' moods. They worked their way downstream, clearing branches and ice chunks that threatened to form blockages. The creek burbled louder with each obstruction they removed, as if thanking them for freeing its path. "Sebastian, look there." Maggie pointed to where the water curved sharply around a cluster of ancient cottonwoods. Something gleamed beneath the surface, trapped in the twisted roots that reached into the stream. Sebastian squinted against the morning glare. "Might be metal. Could be dangerous if it's caught up in there." He worked his way carefully to the water's edge, using his pole to probe the ice-rimmed pool. After several attempts, he managed to snag whatever lay beneath the surface. "Give me a hand with the rope," he called to Maggie. Together they secured a loop around the object and pulled. With a great sucking sound, a leather mail pouch emerged from its watery grave. It was weathered almost black, its brass fittings dulled by decades underwater, but the heavy oiled leather had preserved its contents. "United States Mail," Maggie read the faded lettering aloud. "Sebastian, this must have been lost years ago." Sebastian's face had gone still. 40 years, I reckon." His voice was quiet. "Back when the stage route still ran through here." They carried their find back to the cabin, water streaming from its sides. Inside, Sebastian cleared space by the hearth, while Maggie carefully opened the pouch's rotting clasp. Dozens of letters spilled out, their paper somehow preserved by the leather's protection and the creek's cold waters. "Look at the dates," Maggie breathed, examining the postmarks. 1843. 44. Her fingers moved carefully through the pile. These would have been during the height of the gold rush. Sebastian's movements had become precise, almost reverential, as he spread the letters to dry. Many bore the names of miners long dead, their dreams of striking it rich buried with them in forgotten claims. Among the sodden papers, a small leather-bound book caught Maggie's eye. "It's a postmaster's logbook," she said, carefully separating its damp pages. Her expression changed as she read. "Sebastian, there are entries here about deliberately holding back claim notices, delaying them until certain parties could file ahead of the rightful claimants." Sebastian's head snapped up. "What name?" "Postmaster Gerald Whitaker." Maggie looked up at him. "Did you know him?" "Knew of him." Sebastian's voice was grim. "He left town sudden-like back then. Some folks lost their claims in strange ways about that time. Never could prove nothing." They worked in silence for a while, carefully separating the letters. The fire's warmth gradually drew out the decades of dampness, filling the cabin with the musty smell of old paper and long-buried secrets. Then Maggie's hand stilled. She held up an envelope, its paper yellowed but the writing still clear. "Mr. Sebastian McCready, Silver Hollow." The handwriting was delicate, feminine. Sebastian's face went pale beneath his weathered tan. "That's Anna's hand." His fingers trembled as he reached for the letter, then drew back. "I can't," he whispered. "Not yet." Maggie understood. Some wounds needed time before they could be reopened, even for healing. She placed the letter carefully on the mantel, where the firelight caught the faded ink of Anna's final words to the man she'd meant to marry. The afternoon deepened into evening as they continued sorting through the mail pouch's contents. Many letters bore news of birth and death, joy and sorrow, life's tide flowing on while these messages lay silent beneath the creek's waters. Each one represented a thread of someone's story, preserved by chance or providence in the mountain stream. Sebastian worked mechanically until the sun touched the western peaks. Then he stood abruptly, going to check on the animals as he did every evening. But Maggie noticed his glance returning again and again to Anna's letter on the mantel. When he came back inside, Maggie had soup warming on the stove. They ate quietly, the weight of the day's discovery filling the space between them. After the dishes were done, Sebastian settled into his chair by the fire, his worn Bible in his lap, but his eyes kept straying to the mantel. Finally he spoke. "Reckon I need to read it." His voice was rough. "But I don't know if I can bear to do it alone." Maggie sat quietly in the chair opposite him. "Would you like me to stay?" Sebastian nodded, unable to speak, but he made no move toward the letter. "Shall we pray first?" Maggie asked gently. Another nod. Sebastian's calloused hands clasped together, white-knuckled. "Dear Lord," Maggie began softly, "grant us courage for what lies within these pages. Help us remember that your love bridges all distances, even those of time and loss. Give Sebastian strength to face what was meant for him so long ago. Amen." "Amen," Sebastian whispered. He stood slowly and took the letter from the mantel, holding it as carefully as if it were made of blown glass. But still he didn't open it. "Would you like me to read it to you?" Maggie offered. Sebastian sank back into his chair, letter trembling in his hands. "Please," he managed. But before Maggie could take the envelope, Sebastian's voice stopped her. Just give me a moment to pray again." He closed his eyes, his lips moving silently in the firelight. Whatever words passed between him and his Maker in that quiet moment seemed to steady him, for when he opened his eyes, they were clear and calm. The letter remained unopened on his knee as the fire crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, the creek's voice rose and fell, singing its eternal song of time's passage and the secrets it carried. Inside, two souls waited in the firelight, gathering courage to face words written 4 decades ago by a hand long stilled, yet somehow preserved for this moment. The lamp cast a warm glow across the cabin as Maggie settled back into her chair. Sebastian still held Anna's unopened letter, his weathered hands trembling slightly in the flickering light. "She wouldn't want you to be afraid," Maggie said softly. "Anna always faced things head-on, remember?" Sebastian's throat worked as he swallowed hard. "That she did." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Even when the fever took hold, folks said she never lost her spirit." Maggie leaned forward, her eyes gentle. "Then honor that spirit now. Let her words finally reach you." Sebastian nodded slowly. With careful fingers, he broke the brittle seal. The paper crackled as he unfolded it, age-yellowed but still bearing Anna's delicate script. He squinted at the faded ink, then looked up helplessly at Maggie. "Would you?" he started, then had to clear his throat. "Would you read it? My eyes ain't what they used to be." Maggie took the letter carefully, smoothing it in her lap. The lamplight caught the tears already gathering in her eyes as she recognized her sister's handwriting. She began to read in a clear, steady voice. "Dearest Sebastian, if this letter finds you, know that I face my final hours with peace in my heart and no blame in my thoughts. The fever came swift, but God's mercy is swifter still. I know you would have returned from your claim had you known I was ill. Please don't carry guilt for what you couldn't change. Our time together was brief but precious. I see now that life gives us not what we expect, but what we need for growth in faith and love. The years ahead belong to you, my dear one. Live them fully, as God intends. Don't waste them mourning what was taken. That would grieve me more than death itself. I go to my rest, knowing love touched my life through you. Let it touch yours again when God wills. My prayer is that you'll find the courage to open your heart once more. With eternal affection and forgiveness, Anna." Sebastian's shoulders began to shake before Maggie finished reading. As the last words fell into the quiet room, he buried his face in his hands. Deep, racking sobs tore from his chest, 40 years of grief finally breaking free. Maggie set the letter gently aside and moved to kneel beside his chair. Without hesitation, she drew his head to her shoulder, holding him as he wept. Her own tears fell silently into his silver hair. "Let it out," she whispered, rocking slightly. "Let it all out at last." "I should have been there," Sebastian choked out between sobs. "Should have come back sooner. She knew your heart." Maggie soothed. She understood. And now she's given you permission to live again. They stayed that way for a long while, the old man's grief gradually softening into quiet tears. When he finally straightened up, wiping his eyes with a trembling hand, something had changed in his face. The hard shell of decades of guilt had cracked open, leaving him raw but somehow younger. Maybe, Maggie said softly, this is what Anna hoped for all along, that someday her words would reach you and set you free. Sebastian looked at her with red-rimmed eyes. You reckon that's why you were led here? To make sure her message finally got through? God works in mysterious ways, Maggie smiled, squeezing his hand. Sometimes he uses a lost mailbag and a misaddressed letter to bring healing. As the evening deepened, they sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the pop and crackle of the fire. The letter lay on the table between them, its long-held message finally delivered. Morning brought weak sunshine and a crisp breeze. Sebastian rose early, moving with purpose. He took the postmaster's logbook from where it lay by the hearth and opened the stove's iron door. Time to let this piece of the past go, he said as Maggie watched from the table. These sins ain't mine to carry anymore. The leather-bound book caught quickly, its pages curling and blackening in the flames. Sebastian stood watching until it was completely consumed, then closed the stove door with a decisive clang. Got a roof that needs mending, he announced, his voice lighter than Maggie had ever heard it. Reckon you're handy with a hammer? They spent the afternoon up on the cabin's roof, replacing worn shingles and patching holes. Sebastian showed Maggie how to test each board for soundness, their work punctuated by comfortable conversation and, surprisingly, laughter. When Sebastian lost his grip on a hammer and had to scramble down 3 rows of shingles to retrieve it, his sheepish expression set Maggie giggling. Soon he joined in, his rusty chuckle growing into a full-throated laugh that echoed off the mountainside. Lord above, he wheezed, wiping his eyes. Can't remember the last time I laughed like that. It suits you, Maggie said, smiling. You should do it more often. As evening approached and the work was finished, Sebastian grew thoughtful. Over their simple supper of beans and cornbread, he cleared his throat. Been thinking, he said slowly. Woman living up here ought to know how to handle a rifle. Would you be willing to learn? Maggie set down her spoon, considering. I'd like that, though I've never shot anything bigger than an air rifle. Sebastian nodded approvingly. We'll start tomorrow if you're agreeable. Got an old Winchester that's gentle enough to learn on. After the dishes were done, he brought out the rifle, showing her how to check that it was unloaded before handling it. In the lamp's glow, he demonstrated the proper way to hold it, how to sight along the barrel, how to stand for the best balance. Maggie paid close attention, her hands sure and steady as she practiced mounting the rifle to her shoulder. Sebastian watched with growing respect as she mastered each lesson quickly. You've got a natural feel for it, he said, pleased. Tomorrow we'll try it with ammunition. See how you do with actual firing. Maggie carefully set the rifle back in its rack. Thank you for teaching me, she said quietly. It means a lot that you trust me with this. Sebastian's face softened. Reckon there's a lot of things I need to learn to trust again. He glanced at Anna's letter, now carefully preserved in his Bible, including that it's never too late for change. They settled into their evening routine, Sebastian in his chair by the fire, Maggie at the table with her mending. But the silence between them had transformed from the wary distance of strangers to the comfortable quiet of family. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and the creek sang its endless song. Inside, 2 souls who had been running from grief found themselves walking toward healing, guided by words of love written 4 decades ago and delivered at last by God's perfect timing. The last patches of snow melted into muddy puddles as March drew to a close. Warmer breezes whispered through the pines, carrying promises of spring to the little cabin in Silver Hollow. Inside, Maggie knelt by the window, carefully placing cabbage seeds in wooden boxes filled with rich soil she'd gathered from beneath the melting drifts. "These'll need plenty of sun," she murmured, pressing each dark seed into the earth with gentle fingers. "Come summer, we'll have fresh greens for our table." Sebastian paused in his work of re-chinking the cabin walls, watching her from across the room. The word "our" settled in his chest like a warm coal. Strange how natural it felt now, sharing his space with another soul after so many years alone. He returned to his task, methodically scraping out the old mixture of clay and straw from between the logs. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, catching dust motes in golden beams as he worked. The familiar motions of maintenance filled his hands, while his mind wandered to the changes these past months had brought. "This wall's nearly done," he announced, stepping back to examine his work. "Reckon it'll keep the spring rains out proper now." Maggie looked up from her planting, brushing soil from her hands. "The whole cabin's stronger for your care, though I was thinking—" She hesitated, then continued. "The porch could use some attention come warmer weather. Those boards creak something fierce." Sebastian nodded slowly. "Been meaning to rebuild it these past few years. Never seemed worth the trouble when it was just me." He ran a calloused hand along the doorframe. "Might even add another room, if you're of a mind to stay." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Maggie's hands stilled over her seedlings. "Two old souls can still serve the Lord together," she said softly, not looking up. "Whatever form that service takes." Sebastian didn't respond, but his weathered face softened as he watched her tend to her plants. Later that afternoon, while Maggie prepared their evening meal, he slipped out to his workshop behind the cabin. There, among the wood shavings and tools, stood a chair he'd been crafting in secret moments. Oak, solid and sure, with gentle curves that would cradle the body comfortably. Taking up his carving knife, he traced careful letters across the top rail. Maggie. His hands, steady from decades of detailed mining work, shaped each letter with precision. When finished, he ran his fingers over the carved name, feeling the truth of it beneath his touch. The quiet afternoon was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Sebastian stepped out of his workshop to see a familiar figure riding up the trail. Joe Turner, one of the traders who regularly traversed the mountain passes between mining camps. "Afternoon, McCready," Turner called, dismounting with a grunt. "Thought I'd stop by, see if you needed any supplies." His eyes crinkled with barely concealed curiosity as he spotted Maggie through the cabin window. "Got what we need," Sebastian replied, but gestured for the trader to join him on the old porch. "Though I wouldn't say no to news from down below." Turner settled his bulk against the railing, which creaked ominously. "Well, biggest news is them survey crews coming through. Railroad's fixing to put a tunnel right through Silver Hollow." He paused, gauging Sebastian's reaction. "They're due any day now, marking out the route." Sebastian's face darkened briefly, but he only shrugged. "Don't see how it concerns me. This land's been mine since '63, proper deeded and paid for." "True enough," Turner agreed, though his expression suggested he knew more than he was saying. "Times are changing, though. Railroad's got powerful friends in Denver." Before Sebastian could respond, Maggie appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Won't you stay for supper, Mr. Turner? I've got a stew on that'll stretch for 3. The trader's eyes lit up at the offer, but he shook his head regretfully. Much obliged, Ms. Ellsworth, but I've got deliveries waiting in town. Speaking of which, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out 2 worn hymnals. Pastor Vale asked me to return these, said to tell you he's got newer ones now for the church. Maggie accepted the books with a smile. That reminds me, she said, turning to Sebastian. We should ride into town soon. Thank the pastor proper for lending these. Maybe attend a service? Sebastian shifted uncomfortably, but nodded. Weather holds, we could go next Sunday. He glanced at the sky, where spring clouds were building. Need supplies anyway. After Turner departed, they settled into their evening routine. Maggie stirred the stew while Sebastian set the table, moving around each other with the easy familiarity of long practice. The cabin filled with the rich aroma of cooking, mixed with the fresh scent of spring air through the open window. Smells like your mother's recipe, Sebastian commented, breaking the comfortable silence. Maggie smiled, pleased he remembered her mentioning it. Anna's favorite too. She always said good food could heal most hurts. Sebastian's eyes drifted to the chair he'd been carving, still hidden in his workshop. Your sister was wise about such things. As they ate, Maggie spoke of her plans for a proper vegetable garden once the ground thawed completely. Sebastian listened, offering suggestions about where the soil might be richest, which spots got the best sun. Their conversation flowed easily now, no longer strained by the weight of unspoken grief. Later, as Sebastian banked the fire for the night, he found himself thinking about Turner's news. The railroad didn't trouble him. His deed was solid, his claim to this land absolute. He'd carved his place out of wilderness 40 years ago, paid for it with sweat and gold and loneliness. Surely no one could challenge that. Yet something in Turner's manner nagged at him. The trader had seemed too careful with his words, as if holding something back. Sebastian pushed the thought away. Whatever came, he'd face it. Only now, he realized with quiet wonder, he wouldn't face it alone. Through the window, he could see the first stars appearing in the deepening blue of twilight. Maggie sat in her usual spot by the fire, one of the returned hymnals open in her lap, humming softly as she read. The carved chair waited in his workshop, a promise taking shape in wood and patience. Spring was coming to Silver Hollow, bringing change with it. But for now, in the warm circle of lamplight, Sebastian felt more at peace than he had in 40 years. Whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight was enough. 2 days after the trader's visit, spring sunshine warmed the mountain slopes around Silver Hollow. Sebastian stood on his newly repaired porch, coffee mug in hand, watching a group of riders wind their way up the trail toward his cabin. His grip tightened on the cup as he made out the glint of a sheriff's badge among them. Maggie, he called through the open door, his voice tight. We've got company. She appeared beside him, wiping her hands on her apron. The morning light caught the silver in her hair as she squinted at the approaching party. 4 men rode in formation, 3 in city clothes with surveyor's equipment strapped to their saddles, and Sheriff Amos Dillard bringing up the rear. Sebastian set his jaw and descended the porch steps to meet them. The lead rider, a well-dressed man with a neat mustache, dismounted first. He carried a leather portfolio under one arm. Mr. McCready? The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. I'm Thomas Whitfield, representing the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad Company. He gestured to his companions. These are our surveyors, and I believe you know Sheriff Dillard. Sebastian nodded curtly to the sheriff, who touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. The lawman's weathered face held a hint of discomfort. State your business, Sebastian said, his voice gravelly with suspicion. Whitfield opened his portfolio extracting several official-looking documents. "The railroad has purchased rights-of-way through this valley for our new mountain route. We're here to secure your signature on the transfer agreement." He held out the papers. "You'll find the compensation more than fair." Sebastian didn't take the documents. "This land's been mine since 1863. Got the deed to prove it." "Yes, your homestead claim." Whitfield's tone grew patronizing. "However, the Railroad Act of 1862 grants us certain authorities regarding necessary routes through private land, with federal approval." "Don't care about your federal approval." Sebastian's words cut through the morning air like an axe blade. "This is my home. Not selling, not signing." Behind him, Maggie stepped forward. Her presence seemed to steady him, though his hands had balled into fists at his sides. Sheriff Dillard cleared his throat. "Sebastian, might be wise to at least look at their offer. Times are changing up here in the mountains." "Times always change," Sebastian growled. "Don't mean a man has to bow to them." Whitfield's pleasant facade cracked slightly. "Mr. McCready, be reasonable. This tunnel project will proceed with or without your cooperation. We're trying to handle this amicably." "Amicably?" Sebastian barked a harsh laugh. "You ride onto my land with papers and threats, call that amicable?" "Sebastian," Maggie murmured, laying a gentle hand on his arm. He shrugged it off, taking a step toward the railroad men. The foreman's face hardened. "Very well. We'll return with federal authorization and proceed as necessary." He tucked the papers back into his portfolio. "Good day, Mr. McCready." The party mounted up, turning their horses back down the trail. Sheriff Dillard lingered a moment longer, his expression troubled. "Sebastian, get off my land, Amos." The sheriff sighed and wheeled his horse around, following the others. Soon only the sound of distant hoofbeats and the whisper of wind through pine needles remained. Sebastian stood rigid, watching until the riders disappeared around the bend. Then he turned and strode past Maggie into the cabin. She followed, closing the door softly behind them. "The Lord will show us a path through this," she said, her voice steady despite her obvious concern. Sebastian whirled to face her, his eyes blazing. "The Lord!" He spat the word like poison. "Where was the Lord when Anna died? When claim jumpers murdered my partner in '65? When my brother's farm failed back east?" He stalked to a high shelf and pulled down a dusty bottle of whiskey, untouched for years. Every blessed time I let someone close, let myself believe in something good." His voice cracked. "The world takes it away, and God just watches." Maggie stood her ground as he uncorked the bottle. "That's not true, Sebastian. Look at what he's given you these past months. Look at the healing." "Healing?" Sebastian took a long pull from the bottle. "More like setting me up for another fall. Railroad won't stop. They'll take it all. The cabin, the land, everything I built." He dropped heavily into his chair by the cold hearth. "Everything Anna and I dreamed of." "Then we'll face it together," Maggie insisted. "With prayer and—" "Prayer!" The word exploded from him. 40 years of prayers, and what good did they do? God betrayed me long ago, woman. Best you learn that now." He took another drink, longer this time. Maggie watched him for a moment, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Then she moved quietly to the hearth and began laying a fire, her movements precise and deliberate. As afternoon faded to evening, Sebastian remained in his chair, the bottle slowly emptying. Maggie prepared their usual supper, though he waved it away. She ate alone at the table, then cleared up, all while maintaining a gentle silence that seemed to fill the cabin like a physical presence. The whiskey finally began to take its toll. Sebastian's head nodded, his angry mutters growing softer. Maggie knelt beside his chair, her skirts rustling against the floorboards. In the firelight, her face held nothing but compassion. "Dear Lord," she began softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "hold this good man in your hands tonight. Help him remember your faithfulness through all his years of solitude. Help him see that you brought me here not to add to his burdens, but to share them." Sebastian's breathing grew deeper, more regular. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the newly repaired shingles. The sound seemed to emphasize the shelter of the cabin, the warmth within. "Guard his sleep," Maggie continued, her prayer steady and true. "And when morning comes, grant him clarity to see that no piece of paper, no railroad man's threats can take away what truly matters. The strength you've given him, the peace he's found, the love that still grows even in winter's soil." Sebastian's chin sank to his chest, the empty bottle loose in his grip. Maggie gently took it from his hand and set it aside. She rose quietly and fetched a blanket, draping it over his sleeping form. The wind gusted again, making the cabin creak and groan. Maggie added another log to the fire, then resumed her vigil in her own chair. Through the window, stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, unchanging and eternal above the human concerns below. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But for now, in the fire-lit cabin, Maggie kept watch and prayed, her faith a steady flame against the gathering night. Sebastian slept on, his face finally peaceful, while above them, the wind played its ancient song across the roof of Silver Hollow. Dawn crept over Silver Hollow with hesitant fingers of pale light. Sebastian McCready stood in his doorway, head throbbing, mouth dry as cotton. The empty whiskey bottle on the floor beside his chair mocked him with memories of last night's anger. Outside, fresh split logs needed stacking. Sebastian grabbed his axe, avoiding the kitchen where Maggie worked silently at the stove. The steady thunk of his blade against wood matched the pounding in his skull. Each stroke felt like penance, but couldn't ease the shame burning in his gut. The morning air held a sharp bite. Spring wasn't fully settled in the highlands yet, and clouds gathering over the western peaks promised more snow. Sebastian's shoulders ached as he swung the axe, remembering the harsh words he'd hurled last night. Maggie didn't deserve that. Not after all she'd brought to his home these past months. He heard the cabin door open and close. Bootsteps crunched in the patchy snow behind him. "There's coffee ready," Maggie said quietly. "And biscuits." Sebastian kept chopping, his back to her. "Not hungry." "Sebastian." Her voice carried that same gentle strength that had first unsettled him. "We need to talk about yesterday." The axe bit deep into a log. Sebastian left it there, still not turning. "Nothing to talk about. Railroad's coming. That's that." "That's not what I mean." Maggie stepped closer. "You're letting fear drive you back into darkness. After everything God's shown us these past months, Anna's letter. Don't." Sebastian yanked the axe free with more force than necessary. "Don't bring her into this. She's already in this. Her words were clear. She wanted you to live, Sebastian. To embrace the years God gives, not—" He whirled to face her, axe handle gripped white-knuckled. "What I embrace is my business. You think a few months here makes you an expert on my life? On what I've lost?" Maggie didn't flinch from his anger. "No. But I know what it looks like when a man chooses bitterness over blessing, when he'd rather nurse old wounds than risk new hope." "Hope?" Sebastian barked a harsh laugh. "Railroad's going to take everything. Might as well get used to disappointment now. The only one taking things away right now is you." Maggie's eyes held his, steady and sad. Pushing away friendship, pushing away faith, pushing away the peace you'd finally started to find. Sebastian turned back to his woodpile. Then maybe it's time you pushed on too. Pack your things and head to town before you get caught up in another man's ruin. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of wind through bare branches. Finally, Maggie spoke, her voice soft but firm. If that's what you truly want, I'll go. But I won't go to town. Suit yourself. Sebastian swung the axe, splitting another log with unnecessary force. He didn't turn as her footsteps retreated to the cabin. The door opened and closed. The morning wore on as he worked, sweat cooling on his neck despite the chill air. When he finally carried an armload of wood inside, the cabin felt emptier than it had in 40 years. A folded paper sat on the table beside a cooling cup of coffee. Sebastian ignored it, busying himself with stoking the stove. But his eyes kept returning to that single sheet, until finally he dropped heavily into his chair and unfolded it. Maggie's neat script flowed across the page. I'll be at the line shack down the ridge until your heart cools. When you're ready to remember that God's grace is bigger than railroad men or old hurts, you'll know where to find me. M. Sebastian crumpled the note in his fist, then smoothed it out again. His gaze drifted to the rocking chair he'd built for her, now sitting empty by the hearth. He'd carved her name into the headrest just last week, each letter a confession he hadn't been ready to speak aloud. The day crawled past like molasses in January. Sebastian tried to busy himself with chores, but everything reminded him of Maggie's absence. The swept hearth, the neat stack of dishes, the Bible lying open where she'd left it that morning. As afternoon faded, fat snowflakes began drifting past the window. Sebastian watched them swirl in the gathering dusk, remembering other snows, other losses. The cabin grew cold despite the banked fire. He dozed fitfully in his chair as full dark settled in. In his dreams, Anna came to him, young and bright-eyed as she'd been in '63. She wore the blue calico dress he'd bought her in Denver, her hair caught up with a ribbon. "Oh, Sebastian," she said, shaking her head with fond exasperation. "Still so stubborn after all these years." "Anna, His dream self reached for her, but she stayed just out of reach. "Love lives where pride dies, my dear," she said softly. "I learned that watching you from heaven. When will you learn it here on earth?" Sebastian jerked awake, his heart pounding. The cabin was pitch dark, except for the faint red glow of embers in the stove. Outside, wind moaned through the pines, driving snow against the windows. The line shack. In this weather. He was on his feet before conscious thought took hold, fumbling for his coat and boots. The mule wouldn't like being roused at this hour, but she was sure-footed in snow. Sebastian lit his lantern with shaking hands and stepped out into the storm. The wind nearly took his hat as he crossed to the barn. Inside, Old Bell snorted at the disturbance, but stood quietly for saddling. Sebastian's fingers felt thick and clumsy with cold as he worked the buckles. "Come on, girl," he murmured, leading her out. "Got to make this right." The snow was falling heavier now, but Sebastian knew these trails like he knew his own hands. He'd built that line shack himself 20 years ago as a shelter during long days working the higher pastures. The ridge path would be tricky in the dark, but Old Bell knew the way. They set out slowly, the lantern light creating a small globe of visibility in the swirling white. Sebastian's thoughts tumbled like the snowflakes. What if she'd already left for town instead? What if she'd lost her way in the storm? What if his pride had finally driven away the last chance God would give him? "Please," he whispered into the wind, not sure if he was praying to God or bargaining with the night itself. "Please let her be there." Old Bell picked her way carefully along the ridge trail, steam pluming from her nostrils. Sebastian's hands were numb on the reins, but his heart burned with a clarity he hadn't felt in decades. Every step through the darkness felt like moving from blind stubbornness toward sight, from dead winter toward spring. The line shack materialized out of the snow like a dream, a low, dark shape against the white. A faint glow leaked around the door's edges. Sebastian's throat tightened at that sign of life, that beacon of hope he'd nearly thrown away. He dismounted stiffly, legs trembling. Old Belle would need shelter too. There was a lean-to on the shack's lee side. But first, Sebastian approached the door, snow crunching under his boots. His hand hesitated above the rough wood. Pride dies hard, even in the face of love. But Anna's words echoed in his mind. Love lives where pride dies. He knocked softly, then again louder. For a long moment, only the wind answered. Then the door creaked open, spilling lamplight onto the snow. Maggie stood there, wrapped in her shawl, her face a mixture of concern and cautious hope. "Sebastian? What in heaven's name? I'm sorry," he blurted, the words tumbling out before pride could stop them. "I was wrong. About everything. Please come home." Maggie's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't move from the doorway. "The railroad, we'll face it together," Sebastian said. "Whatever comes. Just don't leave me alone again. I've had enough of alone." The wind gusted between them, carrying snow and possibility. Maggie studied his face for a long moment, then stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in from the cold," she said softly. "We'll talk." Sebastian nodded, ducking his head to hide his own tears. "Need to see to the mule first. Then we can talk about coming home. Both of us." Maggie smiled, and it was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "I'll put coffee on. And Sebastian?" He turned back, snow gathering on his shoulders. "Welcome back," she said. The snow fell thick and heavy as Sebastian followed Old Belle's tracks back to the line shack. The wind had picked up, howling through the pines and erasing their trail almost as quickly as they made it. His lantern cast ghostly shadows across the white landscape, barely cutting through the swirling flakes. "Steady now, girl," he murmured to the mule, who picked her way carefully through deepening drifts. The cold bit through his coat, numbing his fingers on the reins. But something burned in his chest, warming him from within. Urgency, perhaps, or the first stirrings of grace he'd felt in decades. The line shack emerged from the darkness like a smudge against the white world. Sebastian's heart clenched when he saw no light in the window. The lamp he'd seen earlier had gone dark. "Maggie?" he called, stumbling through knee-deep snow to the door. No answer came above the wind's moan. His frozen fingers fumbled with the latch, finally wrenching it open. The interior was black as pitch and cold as the storm outside. Sebastian lifted his lantern, its light falling across the small space, and there, crumpled beside the cold hearth, lay Maggie. "No, dear God, no," he breathed, dropping to his knees beside her still form. Her skin was like ice when he touched her face, but she was breathing, shallow, rapid breaths that barely stirred her chest. Sebastian gathered her into his arms, cradling her head against his shoulder. "Hold on, Maggie, just hold on." His voice broke as he lifted her, surprised by how light she felt, like Anna had felt that last day. No, he wouldn't lose another woman to winter's cruel grip, not when God had finally sent him a second chance at grace. Getting them both onto Old Belle's back was a struggle that left him gasping and sweating despite the cold. Sebastian wrapped Maggie in his coat, holding her secure against his chest with one arm while gripping the reins with his other hand. The mule seemed to sense the urgency, picking up her pace despite the treacherous footing. "Our Father, who art in heaven," Sebastian whispered into Maggie's hair as they rode. The prayer felt rusty on his tongue, but it came easier with each step through the storm. "Hallowed be thy name." By the time they reached his cabin, he'd prayed through every verse he could remember from Scripture. His voice was hoarse, his arms trembling from cold and strain, but Maggie's breathing had grown stronger against his chest. Inside, Sebastian laid her gently on his bed, closest to the stove. He worked quickly, building up the fire until the iron glowed cherry red, heating water for hot bricks to warm the sheets. His hands shook as he tucked blankets around her still form, remembering how she'd done the same for him that first night she arrived. "Don't leave me," he whispered, chafing her cold hands between his. "Not now. Not when I've finally learned to see." The night crawled past with agonizing slowness. Sebastian kept vigil beside the bed, watching color gradually return to Maggie's face. He dozed fitfully in his chair, startling awake at every change in her breathing. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, the cabin grew warm as summer. Dawn was breaking when Maggie's eyes finally fluttered open. Weak light filtered through the frost-covered windows, painting the cabin's interior in soft grays and golds. Sebastian leaned forward, his heart in his throat. "Welcome back," he said softly, echoing her words from earlier. Maggie blinked, slowly, focusing on his face. A faint smile touched her lips. "You came for me." "Of course I did." Sebastian's voice was rough with emotion. "I should never have driven you away in the first place. My pride—" He shook his head. "My cursed pride nearly cost everything. Again." Maggie's hand found his, her grip weak but steady. "Sebastian, I need to tell you something." He waited, holding her hand like it was made of spun glass. "I never truly wanted a husband," she whispered. "When I answered that advertisement, that false advertisement, I was just looking for a place where my heart could serve again. After losing my Thomas, my son, I felt so empty. Teaching couldn't fill it. Midwifery couldn't fill it. But then I found Anna's name in your Bible, and I thought perhaps God had led me here for a reason." Tears rolled down Sebastian's weathered cheeks. "He did lead you here, but not to serve, to save." "To save?" "To save me." Sebastian's voice cracked. "I'm the one who needed saving, Maggie. 40 years I've been dying inside these walls, telling myself I was honoring Anna's memory, but I was just hiding from life, from God, from grace itself." He drew a shuddering breath. "You brought Anna's forgiveness to life, not just in that letter, but in every kind word, every gentle deed. You showed me what she'd want for me, what God wants for me, a chance to live again, to serve again." Maggie's eyes filled with tears of her own. Their clasped hands tightened, holding each other like survivors of a shipwreck finally reaching shore. "Thank you," Sebastian whispered. For the first time since finding her in the line shack, his voice was steady. "Thank you for bringing light back into my life." As if in answer, the storm outside broke. Sunshine burst through the windows, filling the cabin with golden radiance. It caught the tears on their faces, transforming them into diamonds of joy rather than pearls of sorrow. Maggie smiled through her tears. "Look," she said softly. "The heavens themselves are answering." Sebastian looked at the light streaming in, at their joined hands, at the woman who had brought spring back to his winter-bound soul, and for the first time in 40 years, he felt truly, completely warm. 3 days after the storm, Sebastian stood at his cabin window, watching the last patches of snow melt into muddy puddles. The morning sun painted long shadows across the yard where Maggie hung fresh laundry, humming an old hymn. The peaceful scene made his heart feel full in a way he hadn't experienced in decades. The sound of hoofbeats broke the morning quiet. A rider approached at a steady trot, kicking up spring mud. Sebastian recognized Tom Wheeler, one of the younger fellows who worked at the telegraph office in town. Maggie paused in her work, shading her eyes against the sun as Tom dismounted and removed his hat. "Morning, Ms. Ellsworth. Mr. McCready." He pulled a yellow envelope from his jacket. "Telegraph came for you, sir. Marked urgent." Sebastian's weathered hands accepted the telegram, his brow furrowing as he unfolded the paper. The message was brief, but made his heart skip. "Must discuss urgent family business. Stop, please come to Sheriff Dillard's office tomorrow morning. Stop, Daniel McCready, railroad agent. Stop." "Everything all right?" Maggie asked softly, touching his arm. She'd come to stand beside him, concern written across her face. Sebastian handed her the telegram, his throat tight. "McCready," he muttered. "Haven't heard that name spoken by anyone but myself in 20 years, since my boy James headed east." Tom shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "The railroad agent's been asking around town about you, sir. Sheriff Dillard said to tell you he'll be there too. Make sure everything's proper and legal-like." Sebastian nodded, pressing a coin into Tom's hand. "Much obliged for the delivery, son." After the rider departed, Maggie read the telegram again. "Will you go?" Sebastian stared at the distant mountains, their peaks still wrapped in winter white. "Reckon I must. McCready's not a common name in these parts." He turned to her, his eyes troubled. "Would you ride down with me? I'd value your presence." Maggie squeezed his hand. "Of course." The next morning dawned clear and cool. Sebastian and Maggie set out early, following the winding trail down to Silver Hollow. The town had grown since Sebastian's last visit, with new buildings sprouting up along the main street. A few townsfolk paused in their morning routines to watch them pass, whispering behind raised hands. Sheriff Dillard waited on the steps of his office, his badge catching the morning light. "Sebastian," he said warmly, extending his hand. "Been too long." Inside, a young man in a well-cut Eastern suit stood by the window. He turned as they entered, and Sebastian felt the breath leave his lungs. The stranger had James's eyes, his son's eyes, set in a face that might have been his own 40 years ago. "Grandfather," the young man said softly, removing his hat. "I'm Daniel McCready, your grandson." Sebastian gripped the back of a chair to steady himself. "James's boy?" Daniel nodded, emotion making his voice rough. "Pa died 5 years back in St. Louis. His last words were of regret, that he never made things right with you." Maggie guided Sebastian to sit, keeping one hand on his shoulder. Sheriff Dillard quietly closed his office door, giving them privacy. "I've been watching you, grandfather," Daniel continued. "Learning about you. The townsfolk call you the ghost of Silver Hollow, but I saw a man who needed family more than solitude." He reached into his coat and withdrew a stack of familiar letters. "I'm the one who wrote to Mrs. Ellsworth, who arranged for her to come here." Sebastian stared at the letters, then at his grandson. "You forged those mail-order letters?" Daniel's shoulders straightened. "I did. After investigating the railroad's land claims, I found you living alone up there. It took months to arrange everything, to find the right person." He glanced at Maggie. "Someone with a gentle heart, strong faith, and nowhere else to go. Someone who might help an old man remember how to live again." Tears spilled down Sebastian's cheeks. He rose slowly, crossing to where Daniel stood. "You schemed and plotted to trick your grandfather into opening his heart?" His voice broke. "God bless you for it, boy. God bless you." The two men embraced, years of family separation dissolving in their tears. Maggie wiped her own eyes as Sheriff Dillard discreetly turned away, suddenly very interested in studying his office wall. When they finally parted, Sebastian kept his hands on Daniel's shoulders, studying his face. "You look so much like your father. Like I remember him before the arguments that drove him away." "Pa never stopped loving you," Daniel said. "He kept your letters, everyone. Read them to me when I was small, telling me stories about the grandfather who built a life in these mountains." Sebastian shook his head in wonder. "And now you work for the railroad that's trying to take my land?" Daniel's expression grew determined. "That's part of why I'm here. I've been reviewing the survey reports, the proposed tunnel routes. There's another path that would work just as well. Would work better, actually, though it'll cost the company more to build." He spread a map across the sheriff's desk. "If you'll trust me, grandfather, I believe I can protect your home and help the railroad, too." "Trust you?" Sebastian's laugh was soft and wondering. "Boy, you've already done more for me than I could have imagined. You brought Maggie into my life." He turned to smile at her. "Brought me Anna's sister, though you couldn't have known that part of God's plan." Sheriff Dillard cleared his throat. "Seems to me the Lord works in mysterious ways, sometimes through railroad agents with clever minds and good hearts." The door opened, and conversations from the street drifted in. Word had spread through town, and curious faces peered through the windows. Silver Hollow's ghost had found his family again. Sebastian drew himself up straight, suddenly aware of the witnesses to this reunion. But when he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the office. "You thought to trick an old man into living again," he said to Daniel. "God bless you for it, and God bless the day you brought this good woman to my door." Maggie stepped forward to take his hand, her eyes shining. Daniel watched them both, joy and relief written across his features. Outside, the spring sun climbed higher, washing away the last shadows of winter from the streets of Silver Hollow, and from the hearts of those gathered in the sheriff's office, where a family's love had finally found its way home. The morning sun warmed the sheriff's office as Sebastian and Daniel worked through the land agreements. With steady hands, Sebastian signed papers granting the railroad a narrow strip along the western edge of his property. His pen paused over each page, but his heart felt certain. This was right. "The meadow stays untouched," Daniel confirmed, pointing to the surveyor's map. "Anna's resting place will remain yours, grandfather. I've marked it clearly in the deed restrictions." Sebastian's eyes misted. "Thank you, boy." They spent another hour with the town clerk, filing fresh deeds that would protect the cabin and remaining land. Daniel's legal knowledge proved invaluable, ensuring every detail was properly recorded. Maggie watched from a corner chair, her presence lending quiet strength to the proceedings. "That does it," the clerk announced, pressing his official seal into red wax. "This homestead is yours free and clear, Mr. McCready. Nobody can take it now." The ride home felt different. Sebastian sat taller in his saddle, as if a great weight had lifted. Maggie rode beside him, her mare matching his mule's steady pace. The afternoon light painted long shadows across the trail. "Look there," Sebastian said, pointing to the cabin as they crested the final ridge. "Smoke's rising. Pastor Vale must have arrived early." Sure enough, the circuit preacher stood on their broken porch, waving a greeting. "Thought I'd get a fire going for you folks," he called. "Been keeping my promise to visit, though I admit the timing's the Lord's doing." They spent the next hours in peaceful work. Sebastian and Pastor Vale replaced worn porch boards, while Maggie hung fresh muslin curtains she'd sewn weeks before. The fabric glowed in the late sunlight, transforming the cabin's stern face into something welcoming. At supper time, They gathered around the table, no longer just a plank on barrels, but a proper piece Sebastian had crafted during the winter. Maggie's stew filled wooden bowls, and Pastor Vale offered grace. Lord, he prayed, we thank you for bringing this family together, for healing old wounds and making all things new. Bless this home and those who dwell here. Amen. Evening settled over the highlands like a gentle hand. Pastor Vale bid them good night, promising to return soon. Sebastian added wood to the fire, while Maggie cleared away supper dishes. The familiar tasks felt different now, no longer lonely routines, but the comfortable rhythm of shared life. Snow began falling outside, fat flakes catching lamplight through the new curtains. Sebastian settled into his chair by the hearth, and Maggie took her place beside him. The Bible lay open across their laps, their hands resting together on its worn pages. Maggie's voice rose soft and clear in the fire-lit room. Rock of ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee. Sebastian's gravelly baritone joined her on the second line, breaking with emotion but growing stronger. Their voices twined together, carrying the old hymn up through the cabin's rafters. As the last note faded, they sat in peaceful silence, watching flames dance and snow fall. No longer was Sebastian the ghost of Silver Hollow. No longer did Maggie walk alone with her grief. Here, in this cabin reborn by love and forgiveness, they had found their place. Two souls brought together by providence, their hearts restored through faith. The valley transformed as spring deepened into early summer. Where snow had blanketed the slopes just months ago, now wildflowers dotted the meadows in bursts of purple, yellow, and white. The morning air carried the sweet scent of blooming columbine and Indian paintbrush. Maggie knelt beside Anna's grave, her skirts spread around her in the damp grass. Her weathered hands worked carefully, tucking flower seeds into the rich mountain soil. Sebastian had helped her clear the plot earlier, removing winter's debris so new life could take root. Your sister loved wildflowers, Sebastian said softly, setting down his carving tools beside the fresh wooden marker he'd been working on. His knife had carved each letter with reverent care. Love outlives the winter. She did, Maggie agreed, patting the earth gently around the last seeds. These were her favorites, blue flax and evening primrose. They'll bloom all summer long. Sebastian ran his palm over the smooth wood of the marker. Decades of working timber had taught his hands to find the grain, to let the wood's natural beauty shine through. This piece felt different, a labor of love rather than necessity. The sound of hoofbeats drew their attention to the trail. Daniel McCready rode toward them, his horse picking its way carefully through the meadow grass. His face bore good news, even before he dismounted. "Grandfather, Mrs. Ellsworth," he called, tipping his hat. "I've just come from meeting with the survey crew. They've found a better route for the tunnel. It'll pass well north of this meadow now." Sebastian's shoulders relaxed visibly. Though he'd made peace with change coming to Silver Hollow, this news lifted a lingering weight from his heart. "The Lord does provide," he said quietly. Maggie spread a blanket on the grass, and they shared the picnic she'd packed that morning. Fresh bread, hard cheese, and early strawberries from her new garden plot. The sun warmed the hillside as they ate, casting long shadows across Anna's resting place. Daniel spoke of his plans to visit more often, now that the railroad business was settled. "Perhaps by autumn we can add that second room to the cabin," he suggested, "before the winter storms return." Sebastian nodded, studying his grandson's face, so like his son's had been at that age. The bitterness that had driven them apart seemed distant now, melted away like winter snow in spring sunshine. As afternoon faded toward evening, Daniel mounted up for his ride back to town. Sebastian and Maggie walked him to the trail, their steps comfortable and unhurried across a land that had witnessed so much healing. The cabin welcomed them home with familiar creaks and settling sounds. Maggie lit the lamp, its warm glow filling the room where they'd first shared their broken stories months ago. Now those same walls held new memories of laughter, prayer, and reconciliation. Sebastian knelt beside her as she bowed her head for evening prayers. His voice, once silenced by grief, joined hers in gratitude. Outside, the old mule brayed softly in his pen, a peaceful sound in the gathering dusk. Night settled over Silver Hollow, stars appearing one by one above the valley. Through the window, lamplight spilled across the porch where Sebastian and Maggie sat together, their silhouettes merging with the gentle darkness. No ghost haunted these hills now. Only love remained, outlasting winter's chill and bringing new life to this sacred ground. Their prayers of thanksgiving rose into the evening air, mixing with the scent of wildflowers and the promise of tomorrow's dawn. Spring had come at last to Silver Hollow, not just to the land, but to their hearts as well. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.